February 22nd, 1942. The radio message from Washington arrived at Corregidor in the middle of the night, transmitted through layers of military encryption, carrying words that would force Douglas MacArthur to make the most agonizing decision of his career. President Franklin Roosevelt, through Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, was ordering America's most famous general to abandon 75,000 starving, disease-ridden troops trapped on a peninsula, with no hope of rescue, no chance of reinforcement, and no possibility of survival. MacArthur read the message 3 times in the dim light of his headquarters in the Malinta Tunnel, the massive underground complex bored into the rock of Corregidor Island. Around him, the concrete walls sweated in the tropical heat. The air tasted of mildew and diesel fumes from the generators. Outside, Japanese artillery pounded the island every few hours, the shells screaming in from Cavite across the bay. Inside, MacArthur stood motionless, the paper trembling in his hands. The order was clear. He was to leave the Philippines immediately, travel to Mindanao in the southern islands, and from there proceed to Australia to take command of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific. The President of the United States, as Commander-in-Chief, was directly ordering him to go. MacArthur looked up at his Chief of Staff, Major General Richard Sutherland, who had delivered the message. MacArthur said. His voice was quiet, but absolute. Quote, 1. For 3 days, MacArthur refused. He sent messages back to Washington explaining that he could not, in good conscience, leave his troops. He had promised them reinforcements. He had told them help was coming. He had assured them that America would not abandon the Philippines. How could he now save himself while condemning them to death or Japanese prison camps? But the messages from Washington grew more insistent. This was not a request. This was not a suggestion. This was a direct order from the President. Marshall's cables made the situation brutally clear. MacArthur's expertise was needed for the broader war effort. The Philippines were already lost. Nothing MacArthur could do would change that. His death or capture would serve no strategic purpose. His leadership in Australia might turn the tide of the entire Pacific War. The logic was sound. MacArthur knew it. But logic offered no comfort when he thought about the men on Bataan. The Bataan Peninsula, 30 miles across the bay from Corregidor, had become a vision of hell. 76,000 American and Filipino troops had retreated there in early January, falling back from Japanese advances across Luzon. They had been promised reinforcements. Roosevelt himself had announced that the Philippines would be defended. But no reinforcements came. No ships could break through the Japanese blockade. No supplies could be landed. By late February, the men on Bataan were on quarter rations. They ate horses, mules, monkeys, lizards. Malaria swept through the ranks. Dysentery turned the jungle trails into gauntlets of misery. Beriberi swelled their legs and weakened their hearts. They had no quinine, no medicine, no hope. They called themselves the battling bastards of Bataan, and they sang a bitter song. Quote 2, MacArthur knew what they sang. He knew what they thought. They believed he had abandoned them, that he sat in safety on Corregidor while they died in the jungle. The truth was more complicated, but no less painful. MacArthur had moved his headquarters to Corregidor on Christmas Eve, 1941, as Japanese forces closed in on Manila. He had declared Manila an open city to spare it from destruction. He had withdrawn to Bataan to make a stand. He had believed, genuinely believed, that reinforcements would come, but they never did. And now, in late February, with ammunition running low and men collapsing from starvation, MacArthur faced the reality that Bataan would fall. Corregidor would fall. The Philippines would fall. The only question was when. And Roosevelt was ordering him to leave before it happened. On February 25th, 3 days after receiving the order, MacArthur called his senior staff together in the Malinta Tunnel. His wife Jean was there, 45 years old, who had refused to leave without her husband. His son Arthur, 4 years old, who played in the tunnels unaware that the booming sounds outside were meant to kill him. His aide-de-camp, his intelligence officers, his operations staff, all the men who had stood with him through 3 months of siege. MacArthur's face was drawn, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. He had lost weight. They all had. Even on Corregidor, rations were reduced. The island's supplies would not last forever. MacArthur said. He paused, his jaw working. Then he added, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. The room was silent. Outside, another Japanese artillery barrage began, the shells impacting on the surface above them, sending tremors through the concrete. The escape plan was audacious to the point of madness. 4 PT boats would carry MacArthur, his family, and key staff members from Corregidor south, through 600 miles of Japanese-controlled waters to Mindanao, the large southern island still partially in American hands. From there, B-17 bombers would fly them to Australia. The entire journey would take them through seas patrolled by Japanese destroyers, past islands occupied by Japanese forces, across waters where Japanese aircraft hunted anything that moved. The PT boats were small, fast and fragile, 77 feet long, powered by 3 12-cylinder engines that could push them to 40 knots in calm seas. But the seas were not calm. March was typhoon season. The boats would be pounded by waves, drenched by spray, visible to any Japanese patrol that happened to look in the right direction. Lieutenant John Bulkley, commander of PT-41, explained the risks to MacArthur with characteristic bluntness. Quote, 7. MacArthur nodded. Quote, the departure was set for March 11th. MacArthur spent the days before preparing his messages to the troops he would leave behind. To Major General Jonathan Wainwright, who would assume command of all forces in the Philippines, he wrote orders and encouragement. To the men on Bataan, he issued a statement that tried to explain why he was leaving, tried to promise that help would come, tried to maintain morale in a situation where morale was already a fiction. But what could he say? How do you tell 75,000 men that you're abandoning them? That they should keep fighting even though you're leaving? That help is coming even though you know it isn't? MacArthur wrote and rewrote the message. Every version sounded hollow. Every version felt like a lie. In the end, he kept it brief, promised that he would return, and hoped they would understand. On the evening of March 11th, 1942, MacArthur stood on the dock at Corregidor and looked back at the island that had been his home for 2.5 months. The sun was setting behind Bataan, turning the sky orange and red. Smoke rose from fires burning on the peninsula. The sound of distant gunfire carried across the water. 21 people would make the escape. MacArthur, his wife Jean, his son Arthur, the boy's Chinese ama, Chu, and 17 key staff members. They carried almost nothing. A few changes of clothes, some documents, personal items that could fit in small bags. Everything else would be left behind. MacArthur wore his khaki uniform, his gold-braided cap, his sunglasses. Even in retreat, even in what felt like defeat, he maintained the image. It was all he had left. The 4 PT boats waited at the dock, their engines idling, their crews nervous. PT-41 would carry MacArthur, his family, and key staff. PT-34, PT-35, and PT-32 would carry the others. The boats were painted black for night operations, nearly invisible in the darkness. At 7:15 in the evening, the engines roared to life. The boats pulled away from the dock, turned south, and accelerated into the darkness. Behind them, Corregidor's searchlights swept the sky, looking for Japanese bombers. Ahead lay 600 miles of enemy waters and a journey that would take 35 hours of constant danger. The seas were brutal. Within an hour, everyone on the boats was seasick. The PT boats, designed for speed, not comfort, pounded through 8-foot swells. Waves crashed over the bows, drenching everyone on board. The spray was constant, cold despite the tropical heat, mixing with diesel fumes from the engines. John MacArthur held 4-year-old Arthur in her arms, trying to shield him from the spray, trying to keep him calm even as she fought her own nausea. Achu, the ama, huddled nearby, her face green, her eyes closed. The staff officers, even the ones with combat experience, looked miserable. MacArthur stood near the helm, one hand gripping a rail, his face set in grim determination. He refused to sit. He refused to show weakness. If his men on Bataan could endure starvation and disease, he could endure a rough boat ride. The boats traveled in formation, maintaining radio silence, their crews scanning the darkness for Japanese patrols. Every shadow could be an enemy destroyer. Every distant light could be a Japanese base. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to illuminate the white wakes behind the boats, bright enough to make them visible to anyone watching. Around midnight, they passed through the Verde Island Passage, a narrow strait between Luzon and Mindoro. This was the most dangerous part of the journey, the waters most heavily patrolled by Japanese forces. Bulkley pushed the boats to maximum speed, the engines screaming, the hulls slamming against the waves. They saw lights on the shore, Japanese positions on the islands. They saw what might have been ships in the distance, but nothing pursued them. Nothing fired. They raced through the passage and emerged into the open waters of the Mindanao Sea. The seas grew worse as they moved south. The boats were taking a pounding, the constant impacts threatening to shake apart the wooden hulls. One of the engines on PT-32 began to fail, forcing the boat to slow. PT-41 circled back, maintaining formation, refusing to leave anyone behind. Dawn came on March 12th, revealing a gray sky and heaving seas. The boats were supposed to travel only at night, but they were behind schedule, still hours from Mindanao. They had no choice but to continue in daylight, exposed to any Japanese aircraft that might pass overhead. MacArthur watched the sky constantly. He had seen what Japanese bombers could do. He had watched them destroy Clark Field, Manila, Cavite. 4 PT boats in open water would be easy targets, helpless against bombs or strafing runs. But the sky remained empty. Either they were lucky, or the Japanese weren't looking in the right place, or divine providence was watching over them. Hour after hour passed without incident. By the second night, everyone on the boats was exhausted. They had been underway for 24 hours, pounded by waves, soaked by spray, unable to rest. Arthur MacArthur had cried himself to sleep in his mother's arms. The staff officers slumped against rails and bulkheads, too tired to care about the water washing over them. MacArthur remained standing. His legs ached, his back hurt, his stomach churned with nausea. But he would not sit. He would not show weakness. Not now. Not when his men on Bataan were enduring so much worse. At dawn on March 13th, the coast of Mindanao appeared on the horizon. The boats limped into Cagayan Bay, their engines coughing, their crews beyond exhaustion. They had traveled 580 miles through enemy waters without being detected, without being attacked, without losing a single person. It was, by any measure, a miracle. But MacArthur felt no triumph. He had escaped. His men on Bataan had not. The Del Monte airfield in northern Mindanao was a pineapple plantation with a grass runway, one of the few places in the southern Philippines still in American hands. 4 B-17 bombers waited there, sent from Australia to complete MacArthur's evacuation. But the planes were in poor condition, patched and repaired, barely airworthy, and the weather was deteriorating. Storms were moving in. MacArthur spent 2 days at Del Monte, waiting for conditions to improve, sending radio messages to Corregidor, receiving updates on the situation at Bataan. The news was grim. The Japanese were preparing a major offensive. Wainwright reported that ammunition was nearly exhausted. Food was gone. The men were eating anything they could find. On March 17th, The weather cleared enough for the B-17s to attempt the flight to Australia. MacArthur, his family, and his staff boarded the 4 bombers. The planes took off from the grass runway, struggled into the air, and turned south toward Darwin, 1,500 miles away across the Timor Sea. The flight took 9 hours. The planes flew at high altitude to avoid Japanese fighters, the air inside the unpressurized cabins thin and cold. Arthur MacArthur, who had endured the boat journey with surprising resilience, now struggled to breathe. Jean held an oxygen bottle to his face, watching her son's lips turn blue, praying they would land soon. MacArthur sat in silence, staring out the window at the ocean below. He was thinking about Bataan, about the men he had left behind, about the promises he had made and could not keep. The B-17s landed at Darwin in the late afternoon of March 17th. MacArthur stepped off the plane onto Australian soil, his uniform rumpled, his face haggard, his eyes hollow. A crowd of reporters and military officials waited on the tarmac, eager to hear from America's most famous general, eager to learn what had happened in the Philippines. MacArthur stood before them and spoke the words that would define the rest of his war, the promise that would drive every decision he made for the next 3 years. Quote, 9, not quote, 10. His staff had suggested that phrasing, emphasizing the Allied effort, the collective nature of the war, but MacArthur insisted on the personal pronoun. It was a promise from him, personally, to the men he had left behind. It was a vow that he would not rest until he had fulfilled. The words made headlines around the world. In Australia, they offered hope that America would defend the Pacific. In America, they provided a symbol of resistance, a promise of eventual victory. In the Philippines, they gave the starving, dying men on Bataan something to hold on to, a reason to believe that their sacrifice meant something. But promises could not stop bullets. Promises could not feed hungry men. Promises could not hold back the Japanese offensive that began on April 3, 1942. The Japanese attacked Bataan with fresh troops, heavy artillery, and air support. The American and Filipino defenders, reduced to eating tree bark and grass, weakened by months of disease and starvation, could barely lift their rifles. They had almost no ammunition. They had no artillery support. They had no air cover. They had nothing but the desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, they could hold out long enough for MacArthur to keep his promise. They held for 6 days. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward King, commanding the forces on Bataan, surrendered. 76,000 men, the largest surrender in American military history, laid down their weapons and became prisoners of the Japanese. What followed became known as the Bataan Death March. The Japanese, unprepared for so many prisoners and contemptuous of soldiers who had surrendered, forced the captured men to march 65 miles to prison camps. They were given no food, no water, no medical care. Men who fell were bayoneted or shot. Men who asked for water were beaten. Men who tried to help their comrades were killed. Thousands died on that march. Thousands more died in the prison camps that followed. Of the 76,000 men who surrendered on Bataan, only 54,000 survived the war. Corregidor held out for another month. Wainwright, now commanding from the island fortress, endured constant bombardment, dwindling supplies, and the knowledge that no help was coming. On May 6, 1942, with Japanese troops landing on the island and ammunition exhausted, Wainwright surrendered Corregidor and all remaining American forces in the Philippines. MacArthur, in Australia, received the news in his headquarters in Melbourne. He read the reports of the surrenders, the casualty figures, the accounts of the death march. He read messages from survivors who had escaped, who described the conditions, who told him what had happened to the men he had left behind. He locked himself in his office for hours. His staff heard him pacing, heard furniture moving, heard what might have been crying. When he emerged, his face was composed, his uniform perfect, his voice steady, but something had changed. The promise to return had become an obsession. For the next 2.5 years, MacArthur drove his forces northward through the Pacific. He island-hopped through New Guinea, fighting brutal jungle campaigns. He bypassed Japanese strongholds, cutting them off from supply. He husbanded his forces, minimizing casualties, building strength for the eventual return to the Philippines. He kept a map of the Philippines on his office wall. He studied it every day. He planned the invasion in meticulous detail. He argued with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who wanted to bypass the Philippines and strike directly at Japan. He insisted that America had a moral obligation to liberate the Philippines, to rescue the prisoners, to fulfill the promise he had made. In October 1944, 2.5 years after his evacuation, MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte Gulf in the central Philippines. The cameras captured him striding through the surf, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the beach. He walked to a microphone that had been set up on the sand and spoke to the Filipino people. Quote 12. The liberation of the Philippines took 6 months of bitter fighting. Japanese forces, knowing they were defeated, fought to the death. Manila was destroyed in the battle to recapture it, reduced to rubble by Japanese demolitions and American artillery. Over 100,000 Filipino civilians died in the fighting. But MacArthur kept his promise. He returned, he liberated the islands, he freed the prisoners who had survived the camps, including Jonathan Wainwright, who had endured 3 years of captivity and torture, but had never stopped believing that MacArthur would come back. When MacArthur and Wainwright met again in August 1945, after Japan's surrender, the two men embraced. Wainwright wept. MacArthur, who rarely showed emotion in public, had tears in his eyes. "Jim," MacArthur said, using Wainwright's first name. Quote, "Fortune." Wainwright nodded, unable to speak. The question of whether MacArthur was right to leave Corregidor, whether he should have stayed with his men, has been debated by historians for 80 years. Some argue that his evacuation was necessary, that his leadership in Australia and his eventual return justified the decision. Others argue that a commander's place is with his troops, that no strategic consideration outweighs that obligation. MacArthur himself never resolved the question. He defended the decision publicly, arguing that he had followed orders and that his return to the Philippines proved the decision correct. But privately, in conversations with close aides, he admitted that leaving Corregidor was the hardest thing he ever did, that he carried the weight of that decision for the rest of his life. On the night of March 11th, 1942, standing on the dock at Corregidor as the PT boats prepared to leave, MacArthur had looked back at the island one last time. The fires on Bataan glowed in the darkness. The sound of artillery carried across the water. 75,000 men waited in the jungle, hungry, sick, dying, believing their commander was abandoning them. MacArthur had turned to Sutherland and spoken words that his chief of staff would remember for the rest of his life. "I'm going, but I shall return. I will come back if it takes every ship we have, every plane we can put in the air, every man we can spare. I will come back." It was both a promise and a prayer, a vow to the men he was leaving behind, and a plea for the strength to keep it. 29 months later, he kept that promise. But for the thousands who died on Bataan, who perished on the death march, who never left the prison camps, the promise came too late. MacArthur knew that. He carried that knowledge with him for the rest of his life. The price of following orders, the cost of strategic necessity, the weight of command.